Well, I think the overall thing is improved. The overall sound's improved, I mean. But I think
Elvis Presley's pilot says he stayed silent for nearly 5 decades, not because he wanted to protect himself, but because he wanted to protect Elvis. And now he says the world deserves to know what really happened on the King's final flight home, because the truth was never in the newspapers, and it never made it into the official reports. And it begins with one strange moment, one quiet request that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He remembers the date, the hour, the way the cabin felt. Elvis wasn't late. Elvis wasn't rushed. Elvis wasn't even putting on a show the way he usually did when he boarded a plane with his entourage. No, on that final flight, Elvis walked in with a silence so heavy it felt like a warning. The pilot had flown him for years. He'd seen Elvis in every mood a man could have. The exhausted silence after a brutal Vegas show, the bright-eyed spark after a night of recording, the heartbreak he tried to hide after his divorce. He knew the Elvis the world didn't see, the Elvis who took off the crown and let the weight crush his shoulders. But this was different. This wasn't exhaustion. This wasn't sadness. This felt like a man carrying a secret that was too heavy to speak aloud. He said Elvis lowered himself into the seat beside the cockpit door, slower than usual, as if every movement required deliberate care. Hands trembling, just enough for someone who knew him to notice. Breath tight in a way he tried to hide. A soft, almost whispered, "How's the weather up there today, buddy?" Not playful, not loud, but thin. Faint. That wasn't Elvis. And then came the request. "Before we land, let me know. Don't tell the others. Just tap me on the shoulder." It wasn't a dramatic line. It wasn't poetic, but it was deeply strange. Elvis had never asked anything like that before. Not once in all their years together. He always knew when they were landing. He'd prepare himself, fix his hair, adjust his clothes, put on the Elvis the world expected. But today, on that final flight, he didn't want any of that. He didn't want to look in the mirror. He didn't want to be seen. He didn't want the crowd waiting outside to know he was struggling just to stand. The pilot said he nodded, but inside his stomach tightened. Something wasn't right, and Elvis knew it too. For a moment, the pilot thought Elvis might say more. He watched him carefully, how Elvis stared at the floor like he was gathering the courage to speak a truth he'd been hiding. He opened his mouth once, then closed it, ran a hand across his face, took a breath that sounded heavier than any he'd ever taken. "I'm tired," Elvis finally said. Tired in a way sleep doesn't fix. It wasn't a complaint. It wasn't a joke. It was a confession. A man admitting something he'd never dared to say out loud. The pilot says that one single sentence, just 7 quiet words, told him more about Elvis's condition than any doctor ever had. The King didn't say he was sick. He didn't say he was scared. He didn't need to. It was written in the way he slumped, the way he breathed, the way his eyes dimmed instead of shining. He wasn't tired from the travel. He wasn't tired from the shows. He was tired of fighting a battle the public never saw. Still, even in that state, Elvis tried to smile, tried to lighten the moment. "You boys still keeping this bird in the air?" he joked softly. But the humor didn't land. His voice didn't carry. His grin didn't reach his eyes. And for the first time, the pilot says he felt an uneasiness he couldn't shake, an instinct that something was slipping through Elvis's fingers faster than anyone realized. Then, just minutes into the flight, Elvis placed something on the small table beside him. Not a book, not a snack, not paperwork, a folded letter. The pilot didn't read it. He didn't ask. But he saw the way Elvis rested his hand on top of it every few minutes, almost like he was reassuring himself it was still there. The letter, he says, is the one detail he never spoke about publicly until now. Because Elvis didn't write letters unless something was weighing on him, unless something felt final. The pilot says he didn't know what was in that envelope, but he knew what it meant. Elvis was preparing for something. Something he wasn't saying. Something he didn't want anyone else on that plane to see. And as the engines hummed and the plane cut through the darkening sky, he felt the truth settling in his chest. This wasn't just another flight. This wasn't Elvis traveling home. This was a man carrying the weight of an ending he had already accepted. And that's when the pilot realized the official story of Elvis's final days missed something crucial. Something only the crew in that cockpit witnessed. Something he's finally ready to reveal. Most people imagine Elvis Presley's private flights as glamorous. Champagne, laughter, music drifting through the cabin. But the pilot says the truth was very different. The sky was the only place where Elvis stopped performing. Up there, between cities and obligations, he wasn't the king. He was a man trying to hold himself together. The pilot remembers those early years, when Elvis still walked onto the plane with a spark in his step. Back then, after a Vegas show, he'd sink into the nearest seat with that familiar half grin and say, "Well, boys, we survived another one." He wasn't tired. He was electric. The applause still rang in his ears. The adrenaline carried him through the night. But over time, the tone changed. He says the first shift was subtle. Elvis stopped bounding up the steps. He started moving slower, taking deeper breaths, stretching his neck like it constantly hurt. At first, nobody said anything. Elvis didn't want sympathy. He didn't want anyone worrying about him. He wanted to be strong, always strong. Then came the rule changes. And those came from Colonel Parker. Parker called them safety measures, but everyone knew the truth. They were control measures. Elvis wasn't allowed to travel without approval. Certain flight patterns were restricted. Certain cities required immediate return. Even the crew wasn't supposed to talk too long with him unless Parker's people were present. It felt like flying a man inside a cage, the pilot says. A cage in the sky. But when Parker wasn't around, when the door to the cockpit was half open and the engines masked their voices, Elvis talked. Really talked. He talked about the pressure, the loneliness, the fear of disappointing millions of people who looked at him like he was invincible. He talked about Graceland feeling less like home and more like a museum people expected him to live in. He talked about the divorce, the nights he sat alone replaying every moment he wished he could change. He talked about the world closing in on him, everyone wanting something, songwriters, managers, promoters, everyone except the friends who still saw him as a human being. The pilot says Elvis confessed one thing again and again. "I don't know who to trust anymore." And the pilot understood why. He watched it happen in real time. He saw the weight that settled on Elvis after every show, every argument, every doctor visit. The pilot remembers Elvis staring at the radar screen for several seconds before speaking. "Let's change flight paths," he said quietly. No explanation, no request for a reason, just a sudden demand. The crew hesitated. Changing routes wasn't unusual, but changing them without warning, without Parker's clearance, was unheard of. "Where do you want to go, Elvis?" the pilot asked. Elvis pointed toward a direction off the official plan. "Away from the noise," he whispered, "just for a while." The phrasing struck the pilot. Noise? They were 30,000 feet above the world. There was no noise, except the noise in Elvis's mind, the noise of pressure, expectation, exhaustion, and fear. The pilot adjusted the course anyway. For the first time, Elvis sighed in relief. And then, with the engines droning beneath them, he spoke words that shook every man in that cockpit. "I don't think they're telling me everything." The pilot didn't need to ask what he meant. He knew. It was the doctors, the managers, the people who controlled Elvis's schedule like he was a machine instead of a human being. Elvis continued, "Every week it's a new pill, a new excuse, a new promise, but I'm not getting better. And when I ask the hard questions, they change the subject." He paused, gripping the sides of his seat as another tremor passed through him. "I don't trust them anymore. Any of them." This was the confession Elvis had been bearing for years, and the pilot says it was the first time Elvis sounded truly afraid. But then came the moment that none of them ever forgot. Elvis leaned forward, voice trembling, not from fear, but from desperation. "If something happens to me," he said softly, "don't let them spin it. Don't let them turn it into some clean story. I want the truth, not the version they'll sell." The cabin went silent. The crew didn't know what to say. Elvis wasn't talking about a hypothetical future. He wasn't being dramatic. He was talking like a man who felt a clock ticking inside him. Minutes passed before Elvis spoke again. "If I needed to step away," he said, choosing each word slowly, "would you help me do it quietly?" The pilot says no question ever unnerved him more, because Elvis didn't say escape. He didn't say retire. He didn't say take a break. He said step away. A phrase that could mean anything. A phrase that could mean everything. The crew didn't answer. They couldn't. But Elvis didn't push them. He simply stared ahead into the darkness, shoulders sagging under a weight only he understood. The turbulence came again, rattling the plane. Elvis winced, gripping his stomach. His face tightened, not from fear, but from pain. Real physical pain. The pilot finally broke the silence. "Elvis," he said softly, "you need help." Elvis shook his head. "I need honesty," he answered, "and I'm not getting it." For the rest of that flight, Elvis didn't move. His breathing stayed uneven. His eyes stayed distant. He looked like a man bracing for something inevitable. When they finally landed, Elvis pushed himself up slowly, thanked the crew, and said something haunting. "Remember tonight. One day, you'll understand why." The pilot didn't know what he meant, but a few weeks later, on Elvis's final flight, it all came rushing back. The fear, the secrecy, the quiet confessions, the hint that the official story might hide more than the world ever realized. And on that last flight, Elvis did something they still can't forget. The pilot says the last flight didn't feel like an ending at first. It felt like a pause, the kind of quiet moment that comes before something important happens. But Elvis walked onto the plane differently that night. Not slow, not weak, but purposeful, like a man who had already made peace with something no one else understood. He didn't greet the crew with a joke. He didn't flash the famous half-smile. He just nodded, placed a hand on the doorframe for support, and took a long breath as if steadying himself before stepping into the one place where he could still breathe freely. The pilot says it was the calmest he'd seen Elvis in months. Not because he felt better, because he'd stopped pretending. His voice was soft, steady. His eyes carried a strange clarity, like he'd finally decided which truth to accept and which ones to leave behind. Before they even took off, Elvis approached the cockpit and said, "Let me know, right before we head in. I want to see it with my own eyes." No explanation, but the crew understood. He wanted to see home, Graceland, one last time from the sky. They took off into a warm night, the engines humming beneath them. For most of the flight, Elvis sat alone near the front, leaning back with his hand resting on something tucked into his jacket pocket. The pilot didn't ask what it was, but he could guess. Elvis always carried personal letters when something weighed on him. Letters he wrote, rewrote, hid, and rewrote again. Halfway through the flight, Elvis stood and walked toward the cockpit. He was unsteady, but not embarrassed. For the first time, he didn't try to hide the strain on his body. "Mind if I sit with you boys for a bit?" he asked. The pilot nodded, and Elvis eased into the jump seat. For a long moment, he said nothing. He stared through the windshield, like he was looking into the past, or maybe the future he knew he wouldn't reach. Then he whispered a sentence the pilot has never forgotten. "I'm tired of being a story somebody else controls. Not tired of fame, not tired of work, tired of control, of decisions made by others, of narratives shaped without him, of a life lived under pressure so heavy it bent his spirit." He swallowed hard, voice tightening. "I want to go out as a man," he said, "not a product." The pilot says his chest clenched hearing that. Elvis wasn't talking about death. He was talking about dignity, something he felt slipping as the people around him fought over his career, his health, his legacy. Moments later, he asked for the one thing he'd requested before takeoff. "Let me know when we can see home." The pilot adjusted their course. As the plane neared Memphis, he tapped Elvis gently on the shoulder. "We're almost there." Elvis leaned forward. His breathing was shallow. His hands trembled, but his eyes were locked on the window, like a man witnessing a sacred moment. "There she is," he whispered. "Not Graceland, not Memphis, home." The pilot swears Elvis's expression changed completely in that moment. Not fear, not sadness. Peace. True peace. The kind of peace a man finds only when he's facing himself honestly, stripped of everything except the truth he's finally ready to carry. Then Elvis did something the pilot has never spoken about publicly until now. He pulled the folded letter from his jacket and held it against his chest. His lips moved, barely audible, as if he were whispering a prayer, or a goodbye, or the words he wished he could say to someone waiting down below. He didn't open the letter. He didn't hand it to anyone. He simply held it, as if it anchored him to whatever he needed to let go of. And then he said it. One last confession. Quiet, but unmistakable. Whatever happens next, it was already on its way. Don't blame the sky for it. The pilot says he felt a chill run through him. Elvis wasn't predicting anything supernatural. He wasn't claiming a premonition. He was acknowledging the truth his inner circle had been denying for too long. His body was failing, and he knew it. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't fighting. He was accepting. When they landed, Elvis stood slowly, nodded to the crew, and whispered, "Thank you for bringing me home." Hours later, the world shattered with the news. The pilot says he never told anyone about Elvis's final words, the letter. or the peaceful look on his face as he gazed at Graceland from the sky. Not because he wanted to keep secrets, but because he didn't want his memories turned into headlines. But now, all these years later, he believes people should know the truth. Elvis didn't spend his final flight afraid. He spent it finding closure. He spent it remembering who he really was. He spent it going home. Elvis's pilot finally shared the truth behind that last, hauntingly quiet flight. What do you think Elvis was trying to leave behind? And what was he holding on to? Share your thoughts below, and if this story moved you, subscribe for more untold moments from the lives of legends.